The first snow of December fell over St. Petersburg like powdered sugar, soft and silent. Inside an old brick building turned community center, a group of volunteers huddled together, wrapping scarves and jackets into plastic bags. The sound of laughter mingled with the cold air, but in the center of it all stood Sasha Morozova, her bright blue eyes reflecting the snow outside. Sasha wasn't like the others. Her smile carried something warmer, softer, something her friends jokingly called Filipino sunshine. It all began 6 months ago. On a small island in the Philippines, Sasha had traveled there in summer with a few Russian friends, Nikita, Olya, and Roman, after they saw an online video titled The Spirit of Bayanihan. The clip showed villagers carrying an entire bamboo house together, laughing under the tropical sun. It fascinated Sasha, who had grown up in a gray city where people rarely even looked at one another on the subway. Her life before that trip had been ordinary: desk job, deadlines, coffee breaks, and silence. The kind of silence that fills every hallway of modern cities. But when she arrived in the Philippines, something cracked open in her heart. She remembered stepping out of the airport in Manila and being hit by the heavy warmth of tropical air. People smiled at her for no reason. Taxi drivers waved. Children in slippers played on the street and shouted, "Hi, hello!" She couldn't remember the last time a stranger in Russia had smiled at her. On their second day, Sasha and her friends visited a small town in Batangas where a local NGO was rebuilding homes damaged by a typhoon. There she met Luz, a middle-aged Filipino woman whose house had been washed away. Luz didn't have much, but she welcomed the Russians with coffee and pan de sal. "Why are you helping us?" Sasha had asked shyly, unsure of her Tagalog. Luz laughed, her eyes glowing. "Because you are here. Because we all need help sometimes." "That's Bayanihan," Sasha repeated the word slowly. Bayanihan, rolling the syllables on her tongue like a melody. That afternoon, she found herself helping carry hollow blocks under the sun. People of every age joined in. Children passing buckets of sand, grandfathers mixing cement, and women cooking food for everyone. No one complained. No one waited to be thanked. It was the opposite of everything she knew back home. When the volunteers rested, Luz's son began to play a guitar. They sang Anak and Buwan, songs Sasha couldn't understand but somehow felt deeply. Olya cried quietly beside her. Roman smiled, wiping sweat off his brow. Later that night, they gathered around a small bonfire near the beach. Luz told stories about her community, how neighbors would carry each other's burdens, rebuild houses together, and never let anyone go hungry. "In the Philippines," Luz said proudly, "when one falls, we all help them stand." Sasha looked at the sea shimmering in the firelight and whispered, "What if the whole world lived like that?" Luz chuckled. Then there would be no winter. But winter inevitably came. When Sasha returned to Russia, the grayness of St. Petersburg felt heavier than before. The buildings looked taller, colder, quieter. She sat by her office window one day, watching snowflakes melt against the glass, and remembered the warmth of Luz's hands. At lunch, she told her coworkers about the Philippines, about smiles, community kitchens, and rebuilding houses together. They listened politely but returned to their screens. No one could imagine strangers helping strangers without a reason. But Sasha couldn't forget. One night, walking home through the snow, she saw an old man trying to push his car out of an icy parking spot. People walked past him, heads down, scarves pulled high. Sasha hesitated, thinking of Luz. Then she dropped her bag, ran to the car, and started pushing. The man looked surprised. Together, they managed to move the car out of the ice. When it finally rolled free, he laughed in disbelief. "You're freezing," he said. "Why did you stop to help?" She smiled. "Because that's what we do in the Philippines." He stared at her, confused, but smiled back anyway. That night, Sasha couldn't sleep. She thought, what if we had Bayanihan in Russia? The next morning, she called her friends Olya, Nikita, and Roman. They met in a small cafe downtown, sipping hot chocolate while snow fell outside. "What if we started something here?" Sasha began. "Like what?" Nikita asked. "Something like a Bayanihan movement, helping neighbors, strangers, anyone. Not for money, not for fame, just because it's right." Olya raised an eyebrow. "In Russia? People will think we're crazy," Roman chuckled. "They already do." But Sasha's eyes shone with conviction. "We saw what kindness can do. Luz and her neighbors didn't have much, but they shared everything. We can do the same." After a long silence, Olya smiled. All right, let's do it. But we'll need a name. Nikita grinned. Bayanihan. They all laughed. It didn't make sense in Russian, but it felt perfect. The following week, they started small. They shoveled snow from their elderly neighbor's driveway. They left hot tea and bread at bus stops for homeless people. They offered to carry groceries for strangers in their apartment building. At first, people were suspicious. "Are you from a charity?" one woman asked. "No," Sasha said gently. "We're just neighbors." They made a small Facebook page called Russian Bayanihan and began posting photos. Smiling faces, cleared sidewalks, steaming cups of soup handed to strangers. Within a week, dozens joined, then hundreds. Soon, local news picked up the story. Young Russians inspired by Filipino spirit start helping communities during winter. One evening, the team gathered at the community center where it had all begun. Snow piled high against the windows, but inside the air was warm with laughter. They handed out scarves, gloves, and food to anyone who came in. A little girl approached Sasha and offered her a small handmade paper heart. "Spasibo," she said softly. Sasha knelt down and smiled. "In the Philippines, we say salamat po." The girl repeated the words. Giggling, Sasha felt her chest tighten, not from the cold, but from something else. Gratitude. Purpose. She realized that the spirit of Bayanihan had not stayed in the Philippines. It had crossed oceans, hidden inside her heart, waiting for winter to bloom. Later that night, she sat by the window of her apartment, watching the city lights blur in the frost. She thought of Luz and the villagers, the laughter under the sun, the warmth of sinigang soup after a long day of work, and she smiled, whispering to herself in both languages she now loved, "Wherever there is kindness, there is no winter." Outside, the snow continued to fall, but for the first time, St. Petersburg didn't feel cold anymore. By mid-January, the Russian winter was in full force. The Neva River froze into a mirror of pale glass, and the streets of St. Petersburg were buried beneath white hills of snow. Yet in one small neighborhood, something extraordinary was happening. Outside an apartment block, a group of neighbors in thick coats and mittens shoveled snow together while laughing. A small hand-painted sign leaned against a lamppost. Russian Bayanihan, help each other, warm each heart. Children built snowmen beside them, adding scarves with the Philippine flag colors. An old woman waved from her window, handing down mugs of hot tea to the volunteers. It looked more like a festival than community service. And at the center of it all stood Sasha Morozova, cheeks rosy, hair tucked under a wool hat, handing out bread rolls and smiles. When she started the movement just a few weeks earlier, Sasha had no idea it would grow this fast. What began as 4 friends inspired by Filipino kindness had become a small revolution of warmth. Every time someone helped another person, they took a photo and posted it with the hashtag #RussianBayanihan. By now, the tag had gone viral, shared thousands of times across social media. There were stories of students in Moscow clearing snow from dorm rooftops together, families in Yekaterinburg cooking food for the homeless, and even school children in Novosibirsk collecting toys for orphanages. The spirit of Bayanihan had taken root in the frost. One afternoon, Sasha sat in a small cafe downtown with her friends Olya, Roman, and Nikita. They were exhausted but happy, reviewing messages flooding their inbox. "Look at this," Olya said, scrolling through her phone. "A teacher in Kazan says her class started a Bayanihan week. They clean their schoolyard and share snacks with the janitors." Roman grinned. "That's amazing. Even the janitors?" "Everyone," she replied proudly. "Even the janitors." Nikita looked up from his laptop. "You know, this is getting big. A journalist from Moscow Times wants to interview us next week." Sasha blinked in surprise. "Really?" "Yeah," they said, and I quote, "Filipino warmth finds new life in Russian snow." She smiled, her heart swelling. If only Luz could see this. Later that week, the interview aired online. The reporter asked Sasha, "What made you start this movement?" Sasha smiled softly. "It all began in a small Filipino village. I saw people helping each other rebuild homes after a storm. They called it Bayanihan. They didn't do it for money or reward. They did it because it was the right thing to do." "And you think that can work here?" the reporter asked, skeptical. Sasha nodded. "I don't just think, it already has." The video showed clips of smiling Russians helping neighbors, handing out soup, playing with children in the snow. Then it cut to Sasha's final words. When you share warmth, winter loses its power. By February, Russian Bayanihan had reached Moscow. A group of college students from Moscow State University organized a warm hands drive, where volunteers handed out gloves, scarves, and socks to people living on the streets. At one event, Sasha was invited as a guest speaker. She stood on stage under the pale winter sun, her breath fogging the microphone. 6 months ago, she told the crowd, I was standing under the Philippine sun, learning what kindness means. I thought it was just a feeling. But now I see. It's a force. Behind her, a banner fluttered in the cold wind. Kindness has no season. The audience erupted in applause. Some even shouted, Bayanihan! Though their Russian accents made it sound like Bayani Khan, Sasha laughed through tears. Soon, even local government offices began taking notice. In Duma City Hall, a social welfare official proposed a community volunteer day inspired by Sasha's movement. If young people can do this, he said, why not us? News channels started running stories with headlines like, Filipino spirit warms Russian winter, and From Luzon to Leningrad, the movement of kindness. At first, Sasha found it surreal. Every day brought new messages, videos, and photos. People she'd never met were using words like Salamat and Bayanihan, but it wasn't about fame. For her, every act of kindness was another spark against the cold. One particular day stood out. Sasha and her friends were invited to a small rural town near Lake Baikal, where local families wanted to join the movement. The drive took hours through frozen forests and empty roads. When they arrived, they were greeted by children holding handmade signs. Dobro Pojalovat. Welcome, Russian Bayanihan. The villagers had decorated the community hall with paper suns, inspired by the Philippine flag. Inside, tables were set with bowls of hot soup and loaves of bread. As they ate, an old farmer named Mikhail stood up and said, When I was young, people in my village helped each other like this. But we forgot. Thank you for reminding us. Sasha's eyes shimmered with tears. We didn't create this, she said. We just remembered it. The Philippines showed me what humanity looks like. After the meal, the children performed a short dance they'd learned online, tinikling, using broomsticks instead of bamboo poles. The laughter filled the hall, bouncing off the wooden walls like music. For a moment, it felt as though the cold outside no longer existed. When they returned to St. Petersburg, Sasha received a video message on her phone. It was from Luz, her Filipino friend. Hello, my dear Sasha, Luz said, smiling into the camera. Behind her, the sun blazed over the tropical sea. I saw your video on Facebook. Russians doing Bayanihan, who would have thought? You made me so proud. Sasha pressed a hand to her mouth, fighting tears. Luz continued. You see, Anak, warmth doesn't come from the weather. It comes from the heart. You brought the Philippines to the snow. Sasha couldn't stop smiling. By March, something incredible happened. Schools began adding Bayanihan Fridays, where students spent an hour each week doing acts of kindness. Hospitals held free medical days organized by volunteers. Churches, both Orthodox and Catholic, collaborated for charity drives. Even a few small businesses joined in, offering discounts for customers who donated clothes or volunteered. The movement was no longer just Sasha's. It belonged to everyone, but it wasn't without challenges. One evening, Sasha received a letter from the city authorities, warning her that unauthorized gatherings in public spaces could violate certain civic codes. Some critics online mocked the idea, calling it too sentimental or foreign. Sasha sighed, rereading the letter. For a moment, doubt crept in. Maybe she was naive. Maybe kindness couldn't really change a cold world. But then she remembered the faces. The old man she'd helped push his car, the children dancing in Lake Baikal. Luz's voice saying, You brought the Philippines to the snow. She tore up the letter, smiling. No rules can stop love. In early April, as the ice began to melt, the group organized their largest event yet, the Great Bayanihan Winter Farewell. Hundreds gathered in the city square, lighting candles in the snow. Music played, folk songs mixed with Filipino tunes. On a large screen, photos flashed of volunteers from across Russia. Smiling, shoveling, sharing, hugging, Sasha stepped onto the stage, her breath visible in the cool evening air. This winter, she said softly, we learned something powerful. Warmth doesn't come from the sun, it comes from us. Every act of kindness is like a small fire. Together, we lit up a nation. The the crowd cheered. Some cried. Some simply stood in silence, holding candles against their hearts. Above them, snowflakes drifted gently down, catching the light like falling stars. Sasha looked up and whispered, "Salamat, Philippines." That night, as she walked home through the quiet streets, she passed a small bakery with a handwritten sign, "Free bread for the homeless, part of Russian Bayanihan." She stopped and smiled. It had begun as one woman's memory of a village half a world away. Now it was a movement, a bridge of warmth between two nations, and though the snow still covered the ground, it felt like spring had already come. Snow fell in a slow, steady rhythm, blanketing the Russian countryside in a white silence that shimmered like peace. It was February now, 1 year since Luz had left Russia, 1 year since Sasha and her friends first started the Bayanihan movement. What began as a small effort to help elderly neighbors dig out their homes had become something no one expected, a national symbol of unity. The streets of Moscow were alive with something rare, laughter. From the windows of old apartment blocks, children shouted greetings to strangers passing below. In the parks, young people handed out warm soup and scarves to the homeless. Outside a frozen lake, volunteers were organizing what they called the Bayanihan Winter Games, where teams of families, students, and workers competed not for medals, but for who could do the most good. Instead of trophies, the winners got handwritten notes that said, "You made someone's day warmer." The air was cold, but the smiles were genuine. The Russian Bayanihan movement had spread across 50 cities. Schools were teaching about Filipino culture, not through textbooks, but through acts of service. One boy in Novosibirsk gave away his favorite winter coat to a refugee. A group of teachers in St. Petersburg transformed their classrooms into community cafes, where lonely pensioners could come for tea and conversation. And every week, thousands of volunteers would gather online under one hashtag. She was Russian Bayanihan. The news began to notice. A Moscow TV anchor, dressed in a deep blue coat, smiled at the camera. "Across Russia, kindness has become contagious," she said. "From Kaliningrad to Vladivostok, people are calling this a new way of life, inspired by one small island nation, the Philippines." Behind her, the footage rolled, a montage of Russians carrying boxes of food through snowstorms, shoveling paths for their elderly neighbors, and even singing together outside hospitals to cheer the nurses. And at the center of it all was Sasha, the woman who had once been lost in the cold, now the face of a movement that brought light to millions. But she always refused to take credit. When reporters asked, she'd only smile and say, "It wasn't me. It was something I caught, like sunlight from the Philippines. I'm just passing it on." One morning, Sasha received an email. The subject line read, "From Luz." Her heart skipped. She opened it. "Sasha, I've been following everything you've done. The videos, the stories, the laughter. You've brought Bayanihan to life here, in ways even I couldn't imagine. If you ever come back to the Philippines, know that we'll welcome you like family. The barangay misses you. With love, Luz." Sasha sat quietly by her frosted window, staring at the letter. The city outside was gray, but her chest felt warm. She whispered to herself, "Maybe it's time to go back." When she told her fellow volunteers about the idea, they all agreed immediately. They decided to send a small delegation to the Philippines, a group representing the Russian Bayanihan network. Their mission was simple: to return the kindness. By summer, Sasha found herself boarding a plane again. But this time, she wasn't alone. There were 12 of them: doctors, students, engineers, and retirees, each carrying a story of how Bayanihan had changed their lives. As the plane lifted through the clouds, one of the volunteers, a gray-haired teacher named Mikhail, turned to Sasha and said, "You know, I used to think kindness was something we Russians did only for family. You taught me it can be for everyone." Sasha smiled softly. "It wasn't me," she said again. "It was the Filipinos." The Philippines welcomed them with open arms. When Sasha stepped out into the humid Manila air, the contrast struck her immediately, the brightness, the noise, the chaos that felt alive. She inhaled deeply. "It smells like mangoes and kindness," she joked. They traveled south, toward a coastal town in Cebu, the same town where Luz had once taught her how to smile through the rain. As their van entered the village, children waved small paper flags painted with the Russian tricolor and the Filipino sun. Hand-painted banners read, "Welcome our Russian Bayanihan friends." Luz was waiting near the church steps, wearing the same bright smile Sasha remembered from that first day in the marketplace. They ran to each other. No words, just laughter and tears. "I told you you'd come back," Luz said, embracing her tightly. "I told you I couldn't stay away," Sasha replied. Over the following days, Sasha and her group shared what had happened in Russia. In the community hall, they showed videos of snow-covered streets filled with volunteers, schools doing kindness parades, and workers building free heating shelters for the poor. The Filipinos listened with awe and pride. When one elderly fisherman asked how such a movement began, Sasha pointed at Luz. "With her," she said. "And with a single act of generosity. She shared her food when I was lost and freezing. Now, the whole of Russia is sharing warmth." The crowd clapped, many wiping away tears. That evening, the Russians joined a local fiesta. The smell of grilled fish and banana Q filled the air. The Russians danced to tinkling music, laughing as they tried to dodge the bamboo poles. Sasha found herself standing by the shore, the sea reflecting the firelight. Luz walked beside her, holding 2 cups of buko juice. "You know," Luz said softly, "when you left, I wondered if you'd forget about us." "Never," Sasha said. "In every snowflake, I saw your smile." Luz chuckled. "That's too poetic for someone who grew up in minus 20 degrees. "Maybe," Sasha replied. "But you taught me how to find warmth where there's none." They stood there for a long while. 2 women from opposite worlds, bound by the same truth. Kindness knows no borders. Before leaving, Sasha and her delegation announced a new project, a cultural exchange between Filipino and Russian schools. Every winter, Filipino students would send letters, artwork, and short videos to Russian children, reminding them that somewhere in the world, it's always summer, and every summer, Russians would send back stories of their Bayanihan deeds in the snow. It was called Project Warmth. When the mayor of the town asked Sasha what it meant to her personally, she answered, "It means that no act of kindness disappears. It travels from one heart to another, from one country to another, until the whole world feels less cold." Months later, back in Moscow, the Bayanihan spirit still glowed strong. Winter came again, but it felt different this time. Everywhere you looked, you could see traces of the Philippines, not in palm trees or beaches, but in gestures. A neighbor sharing soup, children building snowmen with smiling faces, old women waving at strangers from balconies, and in the middle of Red Square, where a massive winter festival was underway, stood a small booth decorated with Capi's lanterns. A sign read, "From the Philippines, with love, Bayanihan lives here." Inside, Sasha served warm tea to anyone who stopped by. When asked why she kept doing it, she simply smiled and said, "Because somewhere out there, someone once shared warmth with me, and I promised I'd never let it fade." As the snowflakes drifted down, people laughed, music played, and lanterns flickered through the frost. It was a Russian winter, but it glowed like summer, because kindness once planted doesn't die.